You were taught to be afraid of it before you could read. A fire under the earth, a lake of flame that never goes out, waiting for the disobedient, the doubtful, the ones who ask the wrong questions. Not for a year, not for 1,000 years, but forever. Maybe you were a child lying in the dark, counting your sins before sleep, doing the math on your own soul. Maybe someone you loved died outside the faith, and you were left with a horror you could not say out loud, that they might be down there right now. That fear is the most powerful threat ever made to a human being. A tyrant can only kill you once. Hell promised something worse, punishment without end, for a single finite life. But here is the strange thing almost no one tells you. That eternal fiery hell is almost entirely absent from the religion that Abraham, Moses, David, and Isaiah actually practiced. Open the oldest layers of the Hebrew Bible and search for the place you were taught to fear. It is not there. In the beginning, there was only the grave, a silent, shared grave, with no fire in it at all. So this is the mystery this video is going to follow, all the way down. How did the silent grave of the Hebrew prophets become an eternal furnace beneath the earth? Where did the fire come from? Who added it? And why did it end up ruling the Western mind for 1,500 years? We are going to follow that fire back to its source, layer by layer. And we are going to do it with a guide. Because in 1675, a frightened young man tried to use that exact fire as a weapon against the one person in Europe least afraid of it. His name was Baruch Spinoza. And to understand why he could stand unafraid before a furnace that terrified an entire continent, you first have to understand what he saw when he looked into it. The young man's name was Albert Berg. He had once been part of Spinoza's circle, an admirer, almost a student. Then he traveled to Italy, converted to Catholicism with all the heat of the newly saved, and the first thing he did was write his old teacher a long, burning letter, begging him to repent before it was too late. The letter survives. Berg tells Spinoza he is heading for a horrible death and eternal damnation, and asks him, again and again, what awaits him but the everlasting fire. Berg was not a cynic. He was terrified. He had been captured completely by the fear of hell, and out of what he believed was love, he was trying to pass that terror to the one man he had most admired. He came holding the fire like a torch, and the man receiving it had spent his life reasoning his way out of exactly that fear. Years earlier, Spinoza's own community had cast him out with the harshest excommunication in Jewish law, in part because he questioned the immortality of the soul as it was traditionally taught, and rejected a morality built on eternal reward and punishment. That was the dangerous part, because in his world, and in Berg's, the afterlife was treated as the very foundation of obedience. Take away the fire and the crown, and what keeps people in line? Spinoza had asked that question out loud, and he published his most dangerous work anonymously, with a false imprint, because he understood exactly what it would cost. So Berg, holding his torch, had written to perhaps the one man in Europe who had already worked out why that fire held such power over the human mind. Spinoza did not need to prove that hell was unlikely. The texts could show that it had a history. His philosophy could explain why that history acquired such power over the human mind. To see what he saw, we have to go back to the beginning, to the grave that had no fire in it. In the Hebrew Bible, in the original language, the word that later translators would sometimes turn into hell is Sheol. And Sheol is not a lake of fire. It is the grave, the shadowy, silent pit under the earth where the dead go down and lie still. Here is the part that should stop you. In the oldest Hebrew understanding, everyone goes to Sheol. The righteous and the wicked, the faithful and the faithless, all to the same silence. Jacob expects it. Job longs for it as a rest from his suffering. It is not a sentence earned by sin. It is simply death, the common end of all the living, where the dead know nothing. no flames, no separation of the saved from the damned, no consciousness burning on forever. Just the grave, shared by everyone who ever lived. So the most powerful weapon in the history of religious control was at the beginning simply not there. The faith of the prophets did not run on the fear of an eternal fire, which leaves us standing exactly where Spinoza's whole investigation begins. If the earliest religion had no hell, then what, exactly, were the later authorities defending? And where did the fire come from? And ask yourself this: if the faith of Moses and Isaiah never needed hell at all, what does that tell you about the faith that was handed to you? It came, first, from a real place, a place you can still walk to today, a narrow valley on the southern edge of the old city of Jerusalem. Outside the walls of ancient Jerusalem, there was a ravine called, in Hebrew, Gehenna, the Valley of Hinnom. In Greek, the name became Gehenna. And Gehenna is the word that, in the New Testament, gets translated into English as hell. So the cosmic underworld you were taught to fear was at its root a literal location, a valley, with a name, on a map. Now, you may have heard that Gehenna was Jerusalem's burning garbage dump, a place where trash smoldered day and night, which is supposedly where the image of eternal fire came from. You will find that in countless sermons. I am not going to tell you that, because it is almost certainly not true. It cannot be traced back any earlier than a rabbi named David Kimhi, writing in the 13th century after Christ, more than 1,000 years after the biblical period. There is no ancient text and no archaeology behind a perpetually burning dump. It is a medieval guess that hardened into a modern myth. What the Hebrew Bible actually says about the valley is far darker. It was a place of child sacrifice. In the books of Kings and Jeremiah, the Valley of Hinnom is where some Israelites burned their own children as offerings to a god called Molech. The texts name it directly. King Josiah, in his reforms, is said to have deliberately defiled the site so that no one could keep sacrificing their sons and daughters in the fire there. So the valley became a byword for the worst horror the culture could imagine: children burning, the most absolute corruption of the sacred. And over time, that real place of real horror lifted off the ground and turned into a symbol of judgment, a symbol of where the wicked deserve to end up. This is the seed of hell, and notice what it is made of. Not a revelation from heaven, a geography of human atrocity remembered and slowly turned into a threat. The fire of hell began as a fire that human beings lit themselves in a valley for the worst reason imaginable. Then the seed was cultivated in two great transformations. Now stop and consider what that means. If the fire of hell was first lit by human hands in a real valley for the worst reason imaginable, then what else that you were taught to fear might have been built the exact same way? The first transformation answered a question the old grave never asked. Sheol did not care whether you had been good. It took everyone equally. So how did the silent, neutral grave learn to judge? Picture this for a moment. Your whole religion, quietly rewritten by the ideas of the people who conquered you, and you never even notice because it does not happen in a day. It happens across centuries, in the dark, while you are simply trying to survive. It began to change during and after the exile, in a world increasingly shaped by Persian religious ideas. When the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and dragged the Jewish elite into captivity, and when the Persians later freed them, the Jewish religious imagination came into deep contact with the Persian faith, Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism was built around something the old Hebrew religion did not have: a cosmic war between good and evil, and at the end of it, a final judgment in which the dead are raised, sorted, and the wicked face a river of fire. Ideas of resurrection, final judgment, and moral sorting become increasingly visible in Jewish thought during and after this period. The resurrection of the dead, a day of judgment, the idea that the grave is not the end, and that what happens after death depends on how you lived. The grave stops being neutral. It begins to keep accounts. It begins to judge. And here is the quiet thing Spinoza's method makes impossible to unsee. If this idea entered the religion at a datable moment, carried in from a neighboring culture, then it is not an eternal truth revealed once and for all at the beginning. It has a history. And anything with a history was assembled in time, by people, which means it can be taken apart the same way. So now the grave judges. But it still does not burn. For that, judgment had to learn one more thing. The second transformation gave the judgment its fire, its geography, its consciousness, and its eternity. And it came in layers, each one adding something the layer before did not have. First, the Greeks. Alexander conquered the Near East, and Greek ideas flooded in, including the Greek underworld, Hades, and within it, Tartarus, a place where the wicked were punished. Now there was a vocabulary of an afterlife that actively torments, and it fused with the Persian judgment and the remembered horror of Gehenna. Then, in the centuries just before Christianity, Jewish apocalyptic writers began describing, for the first time, fiery pits where the wicked suffer after death. The symbol of Gehenna, the Valley of Burning Children, became the name for that pit. The grave that had learned to judge was now learning to burn. Then Christianity inherited all of it and placed it at the center of everything. The Gospels use the word Gehenna. The book of Revelation gives us the lake of fire. And then the Church Fathers, above all Augustine, hardened it into doctrine. The torment is conscious, it is unending, and most of humanity is going there. The medieval church turned it into a spectacle. Dante's 9 descending circles, the flames painted on every cathedral wall, the sermons engineered to make a congregation feel the heat on their skin. Stand back and look at the whole sequence. Sheol supplied the image of the silent, shared grave. The Valley of Hinnom supplied the image of fire, a real place of horror remembered as a symbol. Persian period thought supplied moral judgment after death. Greek tradition supplied a punitive underworld, a place of conscious suffering. Jewish apocalyptic writing fused these into fiery post-mortem punishment. Christian theology made that punishment eternal, and medieval art and poetry gave it its geography, each layer added by human hands, in an order you can date, none of it descending from the sky. This is how a grave became a furnace. But knowing how hell was built does not yet explain the strangest part of the story. Plenty of ideas get assembled over centuries, and then fade. This one did the opposite. It grew, it spread, and it ruled the Western imagination for 1,500 years, with a grip almost nothing else has ever matched. The question is no longer where the fire came from. The question is why it held. And here we have to be careful, because the easy answer is wrong. Hell was not invented in a single room by cynics as a deliberate conspiracy to control the masses. That is not how it happened, and the history we just traced shows something messier and more human, a doctrine assembled slowly out of grief, borrowing, imagination, and theology. Nobody designed it from scratch, but once it existed, fully built and burning, institutions discovered what it could do. And what it could do was unlike any other tool they had. This is where Spinoza stops being our guide through the history and becomes our guide through the mechanism. In the preface to his most dangerous book, he writes a single sentence that names the whole thing. Superstition is engendered, preserved, and fostered by fear. That is why hell survived. Spinoza saw that human beings, when they feel secure and in command of their lives, do not run to priests and oracles. It is when they are afraid, uncertain, helpless before a fortune they cannot control, that they will believe almost anything. Fear is the soil. Superstition is what grows in it. And those who hold power, he observed, understand this perfectly. The great secret of authority is to keep people afraid and to dress that fear in the colors of religion, so that men will fight for their own servitude as if it were their salvation. The masses, he wrote, are governed chiefly by fear, restrained like a horse with a bridle. Now think about what kind of bridle hell is. A tyrant's threats end at your death. The threat of hell reaches past death into infinity. You cannot escape it by dying. Dying is when it begins. And only one institution claims to hold the keys, the sacraments, the confession, the absolution, the correct belief. So the frightened soul must stay close, obey, give, and never question, for fear of the fire on the other side. That is why it held. Not because anyone proved it was real, but because it was the most perfect instrument of obedience ever assembled, a fear with no exit. This is the logic behind Spinoza's answer to Albert Berg. Not an insult, a diagnosis. He told Berg that he had mistaken superstition for religion, and that the difference between the two is the difference between fear and understanding. For Spinoza, the difference was clear. Superstition grows from fear and ignorance, genuine religion from understanding and justice. A faith driven by the dread of damnation, however sincere, has already crossed into superstition. Berg had come holding the fire like a torch, certain it would light the way home. Spinoza looked at it and saw calmly that it was made of fear, and that fear was the oldest leash in human history. And here is where the history stops being about Persia and Greece and starts being about you. If the fire was assembled by human hands, then the fear of it was installed by human hands. The terror you carried as a child, the nights you lay awake doing the math on your own damnation, that was not the voice of God. When you were a child, lying in the dark and afraid, was that God speaking to you, or was it something else entirely? The fire was never under the earth. It was lit inside you by a doctrine whose power depended on keeping you afraid. So if the fire is out, how do you actually live? Spinoza spent the last part of the Ethics answering exactly that, and the first half of the answer is a single line. A free man thinks of nothing less than death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death, but on life. Set that against a life raised on hell. A person who fears damnation thinks about death constantly. Every act is weighed against its eternal consequence. Every pleasure carries a shadow. The whole of life becomes a nervous negotiation with the afterlife. Their attention is hijacked, pulled forever away from the life in front of them toward a fire that may be waiting behind them. That was Berg, in every line of his letter. The free person does the opposite, not by pretending they will not die, but by refusing to organize their living around the dread of it. Their wisdom is a meditation on life. They are here, in this world, attending to what actually makes a life larger and more alive, instead of trembling before an imagined fire in the next. This is the first thing that replaces hell, not another threat, but the simple return of your attention to the one life you are actually living. So ask yourself one honest question before we go on. What would actually change in your life tomorrow if you stopped negotiating with a fire that was never there? And then Spinoza removes the last brick. The whole structure of hell rests on a transaction. Be good and collect heaven. Be bad and collect the fire. Morality in that system is a payment plan, and you behave because of what you will gain or avoid after you die. Spinoza rejects the entire transaction in one line, near the very end of the Ethics. Blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself. Let that land. The highest state a human being can reach is not a prize handed out after death to those who obeyed. It is not heaven as payment. It is the direct experience of living well and understanding clearly, here and now. Virtue is not the ticket you buy to escape the flames. Virtue is already the reward, in the living of it. And if that is true, the economy of hell collapses completely. You do not need the threat of fire to make you good, any more than you need the promise of gold to make you love. A person who behaves only because they are afraid is not good, Spinoza says. They are merely obedient, driven by a whip held from outside. Real goodness comes from understanding what makes a life flourish and choosing it freely because you can see that it is good. That is what stands where hell used to be. Not lawlessness, not chaos, but a goodness strong enough that it never needed to be terrified into existence. Spinoza died 2 years after Berg's letter, at 44, and the accounts of his death describe something that, in his century, was almost unthinkable. He died calmly. No terror, no deathbed conversion, no clutching at a priest, no panic of a man bargaining with eternity at the end. He died as he had written, a free man whose wisdom was a meditation on life and not on death. Berg, as far as the record shows, kept his fear and his fervor to the end. So when the old fear rises again, and for many people it does, at 3 a.m, at a funeral, in some quiet dread you cannot quite name, remember the road we just walked. Remember Sheol, the silent grave. Remember Hinnom, the real valley. Remember how later traditions gave judgment a furnace, and theology made the furnace eternal. Because once you have seen how it was built, the final truth of it is simple. Hell was never beneath you. It was inside you. And what was put there by fear can be taken out by understanding. 2 letters survived them both, side by side. The convert who promised damnation, and the heretic who answered without fear. One of them was afraid until the end. The other never was.